Welcome back to AmourologyEd, where we do sex and alternative lifestyle education. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between sex, gender, and sexuality. And this is going to kick off a series of videos that are going to be centered around the ideas of gender and sexuality. We're going to kind of cover all of the bases on that and go into a lot more depth regarding those and each specific thing for that. So I'm just going to give kind of an overview in this video as far as the differences between them and what they are. And then we're going to, again, go into more detail later on in later videos. So let's start off by talking about the difference between sex and gender. And this is a really common question, I guess. We're going to very clearly define them here. So sex, we're going to define as what one's reproductive organs are. So it's the physical reproductive organs, generally classified into either male or female, but not always. There are people who have no reproductive organs or both reproductive organs, and we'll talk about that later on. In simple terms, this is the cute little box that you check when you go to the doctor saying that you're male or female. Or now a lot of doctors are actually adding in, I prefer not to say, or other, which is great. But specifically when we're talking about physical health, things that doctors need to know, they need to kind of know what your reproductive organs are. Gender, on the other hand, is much more complicated. This is a system that, a social system that assigns attributes of feminine and masculine to pretty much everything in our lives, whether it be the way you dress, the way you walk, the hairstyle you have, how you talk. All of that stuff is a social construct that is assigned to these different genders, and then we'll talk about the differences and how people are fighting back against this kind of binary social construct too. In order to more clearly define gender, I'm going to use two different ways to help define it. I'm going to use gender identity and gender expression. We can actually break gender identity down even further into two separate categories. So we can have gender identity as in the role that we assign to ourselves, the conception of gender that we have on ourselves. So this may be that, for instance, I tend to present very femme. I have lipstick on, I do very feminine hair. Some people would describe themselves as masculine or butch or androgynous. This is the conception that we have for ourselves. In contrast to this, we have gender roles, which is society's expectation on us defined by our sex. So this is usually bestowed on us by our parents, by our community, by religion, by our peers. It's basically how people tell us we should act, either masculine or feminine or in between, based on these societal constructs. Now, separate from these concepts is gender expression. So this is basically the performance of one's gender, and especially how it is communicated to others. So this may mean my behavior, my style of clothing, my hair that I use. How do I present myself? Do I want to present very femme? Do I want to present very butch? And this may be different than our gender identity. The way that we present ourselves may actually be different than our gender identity, and that's okay. And it's also really important to note that this gender identity can change throughout time, from moment to moment for any given person, and also throughout cultures. The idea that women are homemakers, for instance, is a very Western idea. So when you go into different cultures, the way that gender roles exhibit themselves are going to be very different. Some people like to talk about gender as being on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have male, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have female. And some people maybe fall in the middle of that spectrum. Right in the middle is more androgynous or slightly more masculine or slightly more feminine. This is just one way of describing gender. Another alternative to describing gender is describing it in more of a horseshoe pattern. So this means that the male and female attributes are actually closer together than we think they are, and then everything in between kind of bridges the gap between these two that are actually kind of closer. And as you go more in the horseshoe pattern, more on the spectrum, then you're going to even be further away from these two center point ideals. One more way of describing gender, and my personal favorite actually, is thinking about it in kind of a 3D space rather than it being just along the line of a spectrum, and then being able to pull what you want from the given space. So this may mean that today I want to act really femme, but I also want to go play in the dirt. I want to be kind of tomboy. Or like I can pull I act very butch, but I also have a really soft spot for dressing up really pretty sometimes. So kind of it breaks the illusion or the mold that this is like a linear binary type thing, and kind of gives people the freedom to pick and choose what works for them and not have to adhere to where they fit on the spectrum. That's kind of why it's my personal favorite. It gives me a little bit more freedom to just say, I feel like this today and I feel like this today, and that doesn't mean that I fall anywhere on the spectrum. It just means that I'm me. Sexuality, on the other hand, is usually described as someone's sexual orientation or preference. For instance, I identify as demi-pansexual, and we'll get into what that means in the later videos, but that's my sexual orientation. This is also where you get into the cute little umbrella term that you see a lot, the LGBTQA+. I like to say LGBTQ2IA+. I know that it's a mouthful and it keeps getting longer and longer and it really frustrates people. The reason that I include the 2IA is, and we'll get into exactly what those mean, but the 2 is for two-spirit, intersex is I, and asexual is A. And I really think that these types of personalities, and particularly the two-spirit, because it deals with very marginalized people of color, that it represents a group of people that just don't get showcased a lot. So I like to include that in the main heading or the main umbrella term specifically, just to make sure I'm including those marginalized people. In the later videos, we will go through each of those and discuss them in quite a bit of detail, probably more detail than you will want to know, but it's fascinating. It is also important to note that a person's sexuality can also be on a spectrum or in a 3D space or even a horseshoe like we've discussed in the past. And it can change from day to day, from moment to moment, as a person changes, because we're all tangible beings and we're never static, we're always changing. And as we have different life experiences that open us up to different things. Just to leave you all with a little bit of a discussion topic before next week's video, which is going to be all about lesbians. Think about how gender has defined your role as you are currently in society, and maybe how and why, what early on in your childhood has created this gender role for you. Think about how it's changed and how you would like to see it change in future. And please feel free to leave any comments. I would love to hear people's discussion on this topic. Thank you so much for joining me again. As always, you can find me at AmourologyEd. You can find me on all social media at AmourologyEd. And please join my Facebook group. I think I'm getting ready to start a Patreon, y'all. So if that's something that you would be interested in, I'm contemplating prizes for Patreon, anywhere from bonus episodes to free coaching sessions. So, and I'm thinking of starting probably on the $3 level and going up to, whatever people want to pay. But, but if you like what you see, please, please, please hit subscribe and hit like. That's going to make it easier for people to find me and get this information. And then also you're going to help support making more of these happen for me. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more.